Come, dear soul, you who have wandered through another long day carrying weights that seem far too heavy for human hearts to bear. You who have found your way to this quiet sanctuary in the midst of a world that never seems to pause long enough for weary spirits to catch their breath. Whether the evening has drawn you here for the first time, led by longings you cannot quite name but feel deep in the marrow of your bones, or whether you return as a cherished friend who knows the peace that waits in these sacred moments we share together, you are welcomed with the kind of love that asks no questions about your worthiness and makes no demands upon your strength. See how the harsh fluorescent glare of your daily world begins to soften now, giving way to the warm glow of candlelight that has illuminated human hearts seeking divine comfort for thousands upon thousands of years. Feel the tension in your shoulders, those faithful bearers of burdens both seen and unseen, as they finally receive permission to release what they have been gripping so tightly. What they have been holding onto as if their very survival depended upon maintaining control over circumstances that were never truly within their power to direct or manage according to their will. The noise of your contemporary existence, that constant hum of notifications and demands and urgent matters that proclaimed themselves essential but proved to be merely another distraction from what your soul truly needed, begins to fade like echoes dying away in a vast cathedral built not by human hands but by divine love itself. In its place comes something infinitely more precious than silence, something deeper than the mere absence of sound. This is the presence-filled quiet that surrounds and penetrates every fiber of your being when you finally allow yourself to stop running from the very rest your spirit has been crying out for since the moment you opened your eyes this morning to face another day that seemed designed to test the limits of human endurance. Tonight, precious child of the Most High, you join an invisible community of seekers scattered across this sleeping world. Souls who have discovered that bedtime need not be simply the exhausted collapse at the end of another difficult day, but can become a doorway into communion with the love that holds all things together. The presence that never slumbers and never grows weary of watching over those who have learned to trust their deepest needs to hands infinitely more capable than their own. Some who gather with us in spirit have been walking this contemplative path for many seasons, their hearts already familiar with the rhythms of grace that flow through ancient stories, retold with fresh wonder and contemporary relevance. Others arrive as newcomers to this kind of spiritual exploration, their souls cautiously opening like flowers turning toward morning light, drawn by hungers they may have dismissed as foolishness in the bright, harsh practicality of daylight hours, but which reveal themselves in the gentle darkness as the very voice of divine love, calling them home to rest they have forgotten how to find, peace they have stopped believing possible, hope they had relegated to the realm of childhood dreams that sensible adults are supposed to outgrow, but which actually represent the most mature response to a world that offers so little genuine satisfaction to hearts created for infinite love. Whether you come as a seasoned pilgrim or a curious newcomer, whether your faith feels strong as mountains tonight or fragile as morning mist, whether you approach with gratitude flowing like rivers or with complaints weighing heavy as storm clouds, you belong here completely and without reservation. Your presence in this sacred circle is not accident but appointment, not coincidence but divine invitation extended by the One who knows your name and has been calling you to this place of rest long before you recognized your need for what awaits you here in these moments of grace. Let your breathing slow now to match the ancient rhythms that sustained our spiritual ancestors through their own valleys of struggle and seasons of testing, that carried them through nights that seemed endless and mornings that appeared reluctant to dawn with new mercies and fresh possibilities. Draw air deep into lungs that have been constricted by anxiety and exhale more than carbon dioxide, releasing the accumulated stress and worry and frustration that builds up in human hearts like sediment in a vessel that needs the cleansing flow of divine peace to wash away what does not belong, what was never meant to take up residence in chambers designed to house nothing but love. Your body, that faithful servant which has carried you through every step of this day's journey, begins to remember what it felt like before the day filled it with tension and urgency. Before responsibilities pressed down upon it, like weights it was never designed to bear alone. Each muscle group receives invitation to release its grip upon the day's difficulties, to lay down the burden of holding everything together through sheer force of will, to accept the gift of being held by arms that never grow tired and never let go of what they have chosen to cherish and protect from all harm. This transformation from the frantic pace of contemporary existence to the gentle rhythm of sacred time does not happen through your effort or achievement, but through your willingness to receive what is being freely offered, to accept what you could never earn or purchase or demand as a right, but which flows from the heart of divine love as naturally as light flows from the sun or water flows from an inexhaustible spring that never runs dry regardless of how many thirsty souls come to drink from its abundance. Tonight we begin together a pilgrimage that will carry us across centuries and continents, not through the rushed urgency of modern travel, but through the patient unfolding of contemplation that allows transformation to occur in the depths of your being, where true healing happens, where authentic peace takes root, where lasting hope plants seeds that will bloom long after this night has passed and you have returned to the responsibilities and relationships that fill your days. With their own particular mixture of joy and challenge, we journey toward Bethlehem and Nazareth, toward Galilee and Jerusalem, toward dusty roads where sandaled feet once walked carrying the most important message in human history, toward hillsides where crowds gathered to hear words that changed everything they thought they knew about God and life and love and the purpose for which they had been created and placed in this world at this particular moment in the great story that encompasses every human heart and every human hope from the beginning of time until its ultimate fulfillment in divine love. Chapter 2. Journey into Sacred Lands. Feel yourself crossing now from the artificial boundaries of modern time into the eternal landscape where past and present dissolve like morning mist before the rising sun, where 2,000 years collapse into this single sacred moment as your spirit becomes contemporary with shepherds and fishermen, tax collectors and teachers, ordinary people whose lives were transformed by extraordinary love walking among them in human flesh that could be touched and voices that could be heard and eyes that looked upon them with compassion deeper than any earthly well. The very air around you begins to change as you breathe in something cleaner and more elemental than what fills your contemporary lungs. Air that carries the scent of olive groves and wheat fields, of bread baking in outdoor ovens and sheep being led to green pastures, beside waters that run clear and cold from mountain springs that have never known pollution or contamination from human industry. Run wild beyond the boundaries of wisdom and restraint that honor both human need and divine design for creation's flourishing. Allow your eyes to adjust to light that comes not from electricity captured and tamed by human ingenuity, but from sun and moon and stars creating the natural rhythms by which human life is meant to be measured. Time that flows according to seasons and festivals, sowing and harvest. The patient turning of days and years that teach souls accustomed to instant gratification, the deeper satisfaction that comes from learning to wait with hope, to trust with patience, to work with the understanding that the most important things grow slowly and cannot be rushed without damage to their essential nature and ultimate purpose. The ground beneath your feet transforms from processed surfaces designed for speed and efficiency into pathways worn smooth by countless generations of pilgrims walking toward Jerusalem for festivals that connected them to their ancestors and their God. Merchants carrying goods between distant cities, where cultures met and mingled in ways that prepared the world for a message that would transcend every boundary of race and language and social status. Ordinary families moving through their daily routines of work and worship, birth and death, sorrow and celebration that form the universal human experience in every age and every place. Listen carefully to sounds that fill this ancient landscape, so different from the mechanical noise that surrounds modern existence, like an invisible cage that keeps souls separated from the natural harmonies that speak of divine presence in creation. Instead of traffic and machinery, you hear sheep bleating as they follow their shepherd to safety, their voices creating peaceful melodies that speak of trust and provision, and the kind of care that never grows weary of those entrusted to its protection, never abandons its responsibility, even when the path leads through valleys that cast deep shadows or across terrain that challenges every step of faith. From nearby villages comes the rhythmic sound of women grinding grain between stones that their mothers and grandmothers used before them, of water being drawn from wells that have sustained communities for centuries, of children's laughter echoing through narrow streets, where they play games that require nothing more than imagination and the simple joy of being alive in a world full of wonders too numerous to count or fully comprehend, but perfectly suited to fill young hearts with delight and amazement that adults often lose but can recover when they learn to see through eyes cleansed by grace. The fragrance of baking bread drifts from humble homes where mothers knead dough with the same patient love their ancestors learned through generations of practice, where the simple act of transforming grain into nourishment becomes a daily sacrament that speaks of divine provision and human cooperation with forces larger than themselves, where families will soon gather around tables made holy not by expensive furnishings, but by presence shared, stories told, gratitude expressed for blessings that may seem small to eyes, trained to value only what is spectacular and impressive. Here in this blessed landscape where heaven and earth meet in ways both mysterious and intimate, where the sacred and ordinary dance together without conflict or competition. Every hill whispers stories of divine encounter, and every valley echoes with prayers offered by generations of faithful souls who understood their place in creation's grand symphony and played their part with joy rather than resentment, with trust rather than anxiety, with love rather than fear of what tomorrow might bring to those who have learned to live one day at a time in dependence upon divine grace. This is the world into which the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth, the world where fishermen would leave their nets to follow a carpenter, who spoke with authority that came not from human learning, but from eternal communion with the Father who sent him to seek and save what was lost, to heal what was broken, to restore what had been damaged by sin and selfishness, and the countless ways that human hearts can turn away from the love that created them and calls them home to rest in divine purposes that exceed their understanding, but never their capacity to receive and be transformed by grace. Feel your heart beginning to resonate with rhythms that governed life in this place and time, rhythms that measured existence not by productivity and achievement, but by relationship and rest, by celebration and contemplation, by the understanding that human beings are created for communion with their Creator and with one another in communities that reflect divine love in practical ways that make visible the invisible kingdom of heaven that Jesus came to reveal and establish through his presence and teaching, and ultimate sacrifice that would change everything forever. The terraced hillsides that rise from valley floors like green staircases built by human hands, working in partnership with divine design, speak of generations who understood their work as cooperation with creative forces that blessed their labor with fruitfulness, according to natural laws that rewarded patience and punished presumption, that honored both human effort and divine sovereignty in the mysterious partnership that produces harvest from seed, abundance from scarcity, life from death in cycles that teach faith to every willing heart. Olive trees dot these ancient terraces with their gnarled trunks and silver-green leaves that catch light like countless mirrors reflecting glory back to its source. Their presence a testament to patient endurance through seasons of plenty and seasons of want. Their fruit providing oil that lights lamps and nourishes bodies and speaks in symbol of the Holy Spirit, who anoints and illuminates and sustains spiritual life in human hearts that have been prepared to receive what God offers to all who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Watch how people move differently in this world, where time serves life rather than demanding life serve time. Where urgency exists only when urgency is truly needed. Where the pace of existence allows for conversation and contemplation. For noticing beauty and acknowledging divine presence in daily experiences that modern hurry often renders invisible or irrelevant to souls too busy to see. What is always available to those who have learned to be still and know that the Lord is God. Their faces are marked by sun and honest labor, but their eyes often hold depths of spiritual understanding that come from living close to creation's rhythms and closer still to the Creator whose handiwork surrounds them in forms too beautiful to ignore, too purposeful to dismiss as accident, too generous to explain through purely natural processes that leave no room for divine love or divine design in a universe that speaks so eloquently of both to hearts, prepared to listen and see and wonder at mysteries that science can describe, but never fully explain or replace, with substitutes that satisfy souls created for worship. Chapter 3. The Man from Nazareth. In this gentle landscape where morning mist clings to ancient stones like whispered prayers, ascending toward heaven, where evening breezes carry the sweet fragrance of wild herbs through narrow streets that have known the footsteps of countless generations, there lived a young man whose very presence seemed to transform the atmosphere around him in ways both subtle and profound, whose ordinary appearance concealed mysteries that would soon revolutionize not only individual lives, but the entire course of human history, whose name was Joshua in the Hebrew tongue, though the world would come to know him by its Greek rendering as Jesus. His hands bore the honest calluses of wood and stone, shaped by years of patient labor learned at the workbench of Joseph, the village carpenter whose shop echoed with sounds of creation and restoration, of broken things made whole through skill and patience, of raw materials transformed into objects of both beauty and utility that would serve their owners faithfully for years to come. The scent of cedar shavings and olive wood, of honest sweat, and the satisfaction that comes from work well done, had permeated his clothing and conditioned his understanding of what it means to take formless matter and shape it according to purposes that honor both material and maker. Mary, his mother, had carried within her heart secrets too wonderful to share, yet too powerful to hide completely. Memories of angelic visitations and prophetic words that had stretched her faith to dimensions she never knew existed, but which had also filled her with peace that surpassed understanding when she chose to trust divine purposes that exceeded her ability to comprehend. Her quiet strength and unwavering surrender to divine will had provided the stable foundation from which her extraordinary son would launch a ministry that would reach every corner of the earth and extend through every generation until time itself gives way to eternity. Watch as this young man who possessed the fullness of deity dwelling bodily learned through everyday experiences what it meant to be fully human, to grow in wisdom and stature and favor with both God and neighbor, to navigate the complex relationships and challenging circumstances that shape character and build compassion through direct participation in the joys and sorrows that mark human existence in a world where good and evil contend for dominance over hearts created for fellowship with their Creator but fallen into confusion about their true identity and destiny. He had grown up in Nazareth, that small hillside village where everyone knew everyone else's family history going back several generations, where children played in the same streets their parents and grandparents had known, where the rhythm of life moved with ancient patterns of sunrise and sunset, planting and harvest, festival and fast, birth and death, and all the countless small moments that weave together the fabric of human experience with threads of both suffering and joy, doubt and faith, fear and love that test the strength of every soul's connection to divine grace. The religious and political climate of first-century Palestine provided the backdrop against which Jesus' humanity developed and his divine mission would eventually unfold. A world where Roman occupation created constant tension between earthly allegiance and heavenly loyalty, where religious authorities struggled to maintain their influence while navigating the treacherous waters of imperial politics that cared nothing for Jewish law or custom except insofar as they served Roman interests or threatened Roman peace through rebellion or resistance that might require costly military intervention. The common people, caught between these competing powers, found themselves yearning for deliverance that seemed increasingly unlikely to come through conventional means, for a Messiah who would restore their nation's independence and establish God's kingdom on earth in ways that would vindicate their suffering and reward their faithfulness through centuries of foreign domination and cultural pressure to abandon their distinctive calling as chosen people set apart for divine purposes, sometimes struggle to understand or embrace wholeheartedly. Into this complex environment of frustrated hope and competing loyalties, the carpenter from Nazareth would soon step with a message that challenged every assumption about how God works in the world and what His kingdom looks like when it breaks into human history through incarnate love rather than military conquest, through suffering service rather than dominant power, through grace that transforms enemies into friends rather than justice that destroys opposition, through overwhelming force that leaves no room for mercy or redemption. But for now, in these hidden years of preparation, he was simply learning what it meant to be human while never ceasing to be divine, storing up experiences and observations that would inform his teaching and deepen his compassion for the people he came to save from sin and death and separation from God that had plagued human existence since the garden, where trust was broken and relationship with the Creator became clouded by shame and fear and the desire to hide from the very love that could heal every wound and restore every broken thing to its intended beauty and purpose. The community of Nazareth provided the context for Jesus' formation as a man, yet he also stood apart from it in ways that only became clear in retrospect when disciples and neighbors looked back with understanding illuminated by resurrection and recognized signs they had missed while he lived among them as simply the carpenter's son whose questions in synagogue sometimes penetrated deeper than the rabbis found comfortable, whose insights revealed layers of meaning in familiar texts that had escaped generations of learned commentary and careful study. Village elders would remember conversations that carried weight beyond their simple words, discussions that seemed to access wisdom older than books and deeper than human learning, responses to complex theological questions that cut through centuries of debate to expose fundamental truths, so clear and simple that children could grasp them, yet so profound that scholars would spend lifetimes exploring their implications for how human beings should live in relationship with God and one another. His understanding of Scripture amazed those who knew he had never traveled to Jerusalem for formal rabbinical training, had never studied under famous teachers whose interpretations carried weight in religious circles, had never demonstrated the kind of aggressive ambition that typically characterized young men seeking to establish their authority and build their reputations in communities where knowledge was power and power determined influence over others who looked to religious leaders for guidance in matters both spiritual and practical. When he worked alongside Joseph in the carpenter shop, transforming rough timber into finished furniture, his craftsmanship reflected not merely technical skill, but deeper understanding of what it meant to see potential in unlikely materials, to work with natural grain rather than against it, to apply just enough pressure to shape without breaking, to take time necessary for excellence rather than rushing toward completion that might satisfy impatient customers but would not honor the wood or the craft, or the ultimate purpose for which the piece was being created. These lessons in patient craftsmanship became foundations for later teachings about spiritual formation that requires divine grace working through human cooperation, about transformation that honors individual uniqueness while conforming hearts to divine image, about the kind of love that shapes without forcing, guides without controlling, and accomplishes its purposes through invitation rather than coercion, through attraction rather than manipulation, through example rather than empty words that promise what they cannot deliver or demand what they do not model. The religious establishment of his day composed of men who had dedicated their lives to studying and interpreting divine law, but had somehow lost touch with the divine heart that gave that law its purpose and meaning, would eventually find themselves challenged by this carpenter who spoke with authority they could not match despite their impressive credentials and institutional positions that normally commanded automatic respect from populations trained to submit to religious expertise without question or examination. Chapter 4. The beginning of something sacred. The morning sun broke gently over the wilderness hills where the Jordan River carved its ancient path through landscape that had witnessed countless acts of divine intervention in human history, where prophets had proclaimed divine messages and kings had been anointed for service that extended far beyond personal ambition to encompass divine purposes that would bless not only their own people, but all the nations of the earth through descendants and promises that pointed forward to ultimate fulfillment in someone yet to come. For months now, crowds have been gathering along these sacred banks to hear the powerful voice of John, called the Baptist, whose very appearance challenged conventional expectations about what religious authority should look like, with his rough garment of camel's hair and his simple diet of locusts and wild honey that spoke of complete dependence upon divine provision rather than human planning and accumulation of resources for security that might never actually be tested or prove adequate when genuine trials came to separate authentic faith from mere profession. His message penetrated through layers of religious routine and cultural assumption, like a sword dividing soul from spirit, calling people not to superficial adjustment of external behavior that might impress human observers while leaving hearts unchanged, but to fundamental transformation that went to the very roots of motivation and desire, that addressed not merely what people did, but why they did it, and for whose approval they sought to live their lives in ways that either honored divine purpose or served merely human ambition. The multitudes who came to him represented every level of society, from wealthy merchants whose success had not filled the emptiness in their souls to desperate outcasts, whose poverty had taught them truths about dependence that prosperity often obscures, from learned scribes whose knowledge had somehow failed to produce wisdom to simple farmers, whose closeness to creation's rhythms had prepared their hearts to recognize authentic spiritual authority when they encountered it speaking truth that resonated in places they had forgotten they possessed. Tax collectors who had grown comfortable with collaboration that enriched them financially while impoverishing them spiritually. Soldiers trained in violence who found themselves longing for peace that weapons could never secure. Religious leaders who maintained careful distance from contamination that might compromise their ceremonial purity. Ordinary families seeking guidance for daily struggles that seemed to have no clear solutions in the complex world they inhabited. All found themselves drawn to this wilderness preacher, whose words carried power to convict and comfort simultaneously. Watch as they wade into the muddy waters of Jordan, submitting to baptism that represented far more than ritual cleansing but complete surrender to divine purposes that might require sacrifice of everything they had previously valued, everything they had worked to achieve or accumulate or establish as evidence of divine favor or human success, according to standards that might prove utterly irrelevant when measured against eternal values that last beyond earthly life and temporal achievement. The baptism John offered was public declaration of recognition that spiritual cleansing could not be achieved through human effort alone, that hearts needed washing that only divine grace could provide, that new life required burial of old life and symbolic death that made space for resurrection power to accomplish what human will and determination could never achieve, regardless of how sincere the intention or how persistent the effort to change according to divine standards that exceeded human capacity without supernatural assistance. Then came a morning that began like many others, but would be remembered as long as human hearts beat with hope for redemption, as long as souls search for meaning beyond material success and temporal pleasure, as long as creation groans for liberation, that only divine love can provide through means that exceed human imagination while addressing human need with precision that reveals intimate knowledge of what every heart requires for complete fulfillment and lasting peace. Jesus appeared among the crowd gathered at the river's edge, not as curious observer watching religious phenomenon from safe distance that maintained separation between teacher and student, between holy and common, between divine and human, but as participant seeking to identify completely with human need and human longing for cleansing that goes deeper than water can reach, for renewal that penetrates beyond surface appearance, to transform the very core of being where true change must begin if it is to be authentic and permanent. John's prophetic heart recognized immediately that his entire ministry had been preparation for this moment, that his voice crying in the wilderness had been announcing the arrival of one whose way he had been commissioned to prepare, but whose shoes he was not worthy to untie, whose greatness exceeded his own as infinitely as ocean exceeds raindrop or sun exceeds candle flame, yet whose humility would soon demonstrate itself through willingness to be baptized, like any other penitent seeking divine favor and forgiveness. The Baptist's protest revealed his intuitive understanding of cosmic reversal taking place before his eyes, his recognition that in the presence of this particular candidate for baptism, all normal categories were being overturned, that he was encountering not another seeker requiring cleansing, but the source of all cleansing, not another voice calling for repentance, but the Word made flesh whose very presence fulfilled every prophecy and satisfied every longing that had driven human hearts to seek divine intervention since paradise was lost and relationship with Creator became clouded by sin and shame. But Jesus gently insisted that this baptism was necessary to fulfill all righteousness, to complete the picture of divine identification with human experience that would reach its ultimate expression on a cross, where perfect innocence would bear the guilt of perfect guilt, where divine love would demonstrate its character through willingness to enter fully into human condition, including its deepest need for cleansing and renewal that could only come through grace rather than achievement, through gift rather than payment, through love rather than law. As Jesus descended into Jordan's flowing waters, the very atmosphere around them seemed to change as if all creation held its breath, for what was about to unfold in ways that would transform not only the understanding of those present, but the entire relationship between heaven and earth, between divine holiness and human need, between justice that demands perfection and mercy that provides perfection for those who cannot achieve it through their own efforts, regardless of how sincere or sustained those efforts might be. When he emerged from the river, streaming with water but radiant with something that had nothing to do with Jordan's muddy flow and everything to do with divine approval, the heavens opened like curtains being drawn aside by eager hands, revealing spiritual realities normally hidden from human sight, but made visible in this moment when time intersected with eternity and finite experience, touched infinite purpose in ways that would be remembered and celebrated for thousands of years by believers grateful for what this moment accomplished on their behalf. The Holy Spirit descended upon him in the form of a dove, that ancient symbol of peace and new beginnings, whose gentle landing upon his head spoke of divine approval so complete it required no explanation, no justification, no demonstration beyond its own reality to communicate what every witness understood intuitively, even if they could not immediately grasp its full significance or ultimate implications for their own relationship with God and their own hope for acceptance and approval. The Father's voice thundered across the water with words that echoed through eternity, declaring what perfect love sounds like when it speaks over a life completely surrendered to divine will, completely aligned with divine purpose, completely faithful to divine calling, regardless of personal cost or human misunderstanding or opposition from forces that prefer darkness to light, because light exposes what they would rather keep hidden from examination or accountability. Chapter 5. Words that changed everything. Upon a hillside that slopes gently from the shores of Galilee toward mountains that rise like ancient prayers against the morning sky, where wildflowers carpet the earth in brilliant testimony to divine artistry that surpasses every human attempt to capture beauty in lasting form. Where springs of clear water bubble up from hidden sources to create streams that dance their way toward the great lake that reflects heaven's blue like a mirror polished by loving hands. Jesus found the perfect natural amphitheater for teachings that would echo through centuries and transform the moral consciousness of humanity in ways no other words ever spoken have accomplished. The crowd that gathered represents a cross-section of Palestinian society so diverse that under normal circumstances they would never have chosen to sit together. Their differences in wealth and education, religious commitment, and social status creating barriers that made genuine community nearly impossible according to conventional understanding of who belongs with whom and who deserves respect or attention from those who consider themselves superior in one way or another to their neighbors and fellow travelers through life's complexities. Fishermen whose hands bore the marks of nets and whose clothing carried the scent of their daily labor found themselves sitting beside wealthy merchants dressed in fine robes that proclaimed their success in accumulating material possessions, while learned scribes who had spent years memorizing intricate details of religious law discovered themselves surrounded by illiterate farmers whose understanding of divine truth came not from books but from seasons and soil, from watching seeds die to produce life and trusting in harvest they could not control or guarantee through human effort alone. Mothers holding babies in their arms shared space with elderly men whose bent backs spoke of decades spent in service to families and communities, who may not have fully appreciated their sacrifices, but who had nevertheless benefited from labor and love freely given without expectation of recognition or reward beyond the satisfaction that comes from fulfilling responsibilities that honor both human relationships and divine calling to serve others, rather than merely pursuing personal advancement or accumulation. What drew these diverse groups together was not shared background or common interest or mutual agreement about religious or political questions that normally divided them into competing factions, but hunger for something their souls recognized as essential even when their minds could not define or locate what they needed in a world that offered many forms of temporary satisfaction but seemed incapable of providing lasting peace that hearts created in divine image require for true flourishing rather than mere survival from one disappointing day to another. As Jesus began to speak, his voice carrying clearly across the hillside without strain or artifice, something in his words cut through skepticism and competing interests and social barriers that normally kept people suspicious of one another and protective of their own position and privilege at the expense of generous response to others who might benefit from what they had to offer, but who represented threat to security they had worked to achieve through careful calculation and strategic planning. His teaching carried authority that did not depend upon institutional credentials or political connections, impressive demonstrations of learning that might overwhelm listeners while leaving their hearts untouched, but flowed from perfect knowledge of divine character and perfect alignment with divine purposes that sought not to impress but to heal, not to dominate but to serve, not to accumulate followers for personal aggrandizement, but to reveal truth that could set captives free from bondage they might not even recognize until liberation showed them what freedom truly meant. "Blessed are the poor in spirit," he began, his opening words immediately overturning worldly assumptions about what constitutes divine favor and human worthiness to receive blessing that comes not as reward for achievement, but as gift offered to those who recognize their spiritual poverty and approach divine grace with empty hands and honest hearts that make no claim upon divine favor except desperate need for mercy they cannot earn or deserve, but can only receive through humility that abandons pretense and embraces truth about human condition and divine love. These words fell upon the gathered crowd like rain on thirsty ground, bringing hope to hearts that had been told their circumstances disqualified them from divine attention. Their failures marked them as unworthy of divine love. Their struggles provided evidence of divine disapproval rather than invitation to discover divine grace that flows toward need rather than away from it, that draws near to broken hearts rather than demanding wholeness as prerequisite for acceptance and welcome into divine presence. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven, he continued, revealing that spiritual poverty which acknowledges complete dependence upon divine grace qualifies souls for citizenship in an eternal realm where different values prevail, where worth is not determined by human achievement or accumulation, but by divine love that measures significance according to need rather than performance, according to hunger rather than satisfaction, according to emptiness that creates space for divine filling rather than fullness that leaves no room for grace. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted, he proclaimed with voice that carried healing into places where grief had taken up residence and refused to yield to human attempts at consolation or encouragement that fell short of addressing the depth of loss that can shake foundations of faith and challenge assumptions about divine goodness in a world where suffering seems random and relief appears arbitrary according to human observation that cannot see larger purposes or eternal perspectives that make sense of temporary pain. His words acknowledge that sorrow is not evidence of spiritual failure or divine displeasure, but natural response to living in a broken world where death separates hearts that were created for eternal connection, where injustice wounds souls that long for righteousness, where disappointment follows hopes that were invested in temporal things that cannot bear the weight of infinite longing that only infinite love can satisfy completely and permanently without possibility of loss or diminishment. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. He taught with quiet authority that demonstrated the very quality he was describing, showing that gentleness represents strength under control rather than weakness seeking excuse, humility that knows its true value rather than insecurity that must constantly prove itself worthy of respect and recognition from others, whose approval becomes more important than divine approval that alone provides lasting foundation for identity and purpose and significance. This teaching challenged every assumption about power and success that drove human ambition and competition in a world where survival seemed to require aggressive self-promotion and ruthless elimination of those who might threaten personal advancement or security, where gentleness was interpreted as inability to compete effectively rather than choice to compete according to different rules that honored divine character rather than merely human desire for dominance and control over others. The earth belongs ultimately to those whose strength expresses itself through service rather than domination, whose leadership manifests through example rather than coercion, whose influence flows from love rather than fear or manipulation, that treats others as objects to be used rather than subjects to be served according to divine intention, that all human relationships reflect something of the love that exists between Father and Son in eternal communion that provides pattern for temporal community. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. He promised with certainty that came from perfect knowledge of divine character and divine commitment to satisfy every longing for goodness and truth and beauty that drives human hearts to seek meaning beyond material success and purpose, beyond personal pleasure and significance, beyond social status that fades like morning mist when subjected to eternal evaluation. This hunger represents spiritual health rather than spiritual failure, evidence of divine image within human souls rather than proof of human inadequacy, natural response to being created for relationship with perfect righteousness, rather than settled for approximations and substitutes that promise what they cannot deliver because they lack essential nature of what human hearts actually need for complete satisfaction and lasting peace that the world cannot give and cannot take away once it has been received as gift from divine love. Those who genuinely crave righteousness with intensity that matches physical hunger and thirst find themselves satisfied not through their own efforts to achieve moral perfection, that always falls short of divine standards, but through divine provision of righteousness that comes as gift wrapped in grace and offered freely to anyone willing to acknowledge their need and accept what they could never earn through performance that seeks to establish worthiness through works rather than receiving worthiness through faith in divine love. Chapter 6. Miracles of Compassion. As word of Jesus' revolutionary teachings spread like ripples across still water, reaching into every corner of Palestinian society where conversations around wells and in marketplaces began to center on this carpenter from Nazareth whose words carried power to penetrate hearts and awaken hope in places where hope had been buried beneath disappointment and discouragement. Something else began happening that drew even larger crowds and created even greater excitement among people who had grown accustomed to hearing about divine power but rarely witnessing its demonstration in practical ways that addressed their most pressing needs and deepest fears. The same love that flowed through his teachings like living water began manifesting itself in healings and restorations that defied medical explanation while revealing the heart of divine compassion toward every form of suffering that mars the beauty of creation and causes pain to creatures made in the image of perfect wholeness, perfect health, perfect life that sin has corrupted but grace can restore, according to divine intention that all things should reflect divine glory and serve divine purposes that extend beyond individual benefit to cosmic restoration. These were not theatrical displays designed to impress crowds or validate theological claims or establish religious authority over populations, seeking spiritual leadership they could trust to guide them through treacherous waters of moral confusion and competing interpretations of divine will, but spontaneous responses to human need that revealed what divine love looks like when it encounters brokenness, with power sufficient to heal what seems permanently damaged, to restore what appears irretrievably lost, to resurrect what has died under weight of living in fallen world where good intentions often produce disappointing results. Watch as a leper approaches through the crowd, his movement awkward and hesitant because his condition has isolated him from human community for years beyond counting, his skin bearing marks of disease that has stolen more than health by robbing him of touch and fellowship and the simple human connections that make existence bearable rather than mere endurance of one lonely day after another, without hope for change or improvement, or even basic acceptance from others who instinctively maintain distance that law and custom require, but which his heart experiences as final confirmation of worthlessness. His words, when he finds courage to speak them despite years of learning to expect rejection, carry weight of desperate faith and terrible need combined in petition that acknowledges divine power while remaining uncertain about divine willingness to use that power on behalf of someone whose condition has marked him as unclean, untouchable, beyond the boundaries of respectable society that prefers to forget about suffering. It cannot heal or explain according to comfortable theology that makes divine favor dependent upon human worthiness, rather than divine love that sees past surface appearances to hearts that beat with longing for acceptance and healing that no human remedy can provide. "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean," he says, falling to his knees before Jesus with voice breaking under weight of years, filled with disappointed hope and desperate faith. The plea of someone who has nothing left to lose and everything to gain, who has heard whispers of miraculous healing carried on winds that blow through villages, where stories travel faster than feet can carry them, where rumors of restoration spark flames of possibility in hearts that had learned to live in darkness of resignation and despair. The crowd instinctively begins to step back, creating widening circle of empty space around this man whose greatest need is for someone to come closer rather than retreat, someone to see him as person rather than disease, someone to offer hope rather than condemnation or pity that maintains safe distance while expressing appropriate sympathy that costs nothing and risks nothing and changes nothing about his isolation or his agony or his desperate need for human touch that has been denied him for so long. He has almost forgotten what it felt like to be embraced or even briefly contacted by caring hands. But Jesus does not step back or cover his face or express concern about ritual contamination that association with unclean persons might bring according to religious law that created barriers between clean and unclean, worthy and unworthy, acceptable and abhorrent according to external conditions that had nothing to do with internal character or spiritual hunger or divine love that sees what human eyes cannot see and values what human judgment dismisses as worthless or dangerous or beyond redemption. Instead, his eyes fill with compassion as he sees not just disease that has ravaged this man's body, but deeper wounds that isolation and rejection have carved into his soul through long, lonely years of exile from everything that makes life worth living, everything that speaks of human dignity and divine love and hope for future that includes acceptance and belonging and the kind of community that reflects heavenly reality where no one is excluded based on circumstances beyond their control or conditions that grace can transform in moments of divine intervention. I am willing, he responds with voice that carries authority over every force that opposes human flourishing and divine purposes. Be clean, and immediately, before the eyes of everyone present, the man's skin is restored like that of a healthy child. His flesh made whole, not gradually through natural process of healing that might be explained by medical knowledge or attributed to psychological factors, but instantaneously through supernatural power that demonstrated divine heart toward human suffering and divine commitment to restoration that goes beyond physical cure to encompass spiritual renewal and social restoration. The healing is complete and undeniable, but perhaps even more remarkable is what it reveals about character of one who performed it through means that challenged every assumption about divine power and its relationship to human need, about ritual purity and its relationship to divine love, about boundaries that separate people and purposes that unite them in common experience of needing grace that none deserve, all require for wholeness that enables flourishing rather than mere survival in world designed for abundance but corrupted by selfishness and fear. Jesus did not heal from safe distance with word of command, though he certainly possessed power to do so, but chose instead to touch, to make physical contact, to bridge gap between clean and unclean in demonstration of divine love's willingness to enter into human contamination in order to bring about human restoration that addresses not only physical symptoms but spiritual and emotional wounds that often cause more pain than bodily ailments because they attack sense of worth and belonging and hope that makes suffering bearable when supported by community and unbearable when endured alone. As news of this miracle spreads throughout region like wildfire racing across dry grassland, it draws others who have been carrying their own burdens of physical ailment and spiritual need, people who have heard whispers of hope and dare to believe that perhaps their situations are not as hopeless as they have been told by authorities, who measure possibility by human limitations rather than divine power, who calculate probability based on past experience rather than present opportunity for supernatural intervention in natural processes. A Roman centurion, man of authority accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed without question or delay, approaches not for himself but for his servant who lies paralyzed and suffering at home, unable to work or care for himself, dependent upon kindness of master who genuinely cares about his welfare, rather than viewing him merely as property to be used and discarded when usefulness ends through injury or illness that makes continued service impossible or expensive beyond economic justification. The humility of this foreign soldier who recognizes that he is not worthy to have Jesus enter his house but believes that words spoken from distance would be sufficient to heal his servant, demonstrates faith that amazes even Son of God, understanding of spiritual authority that transcends cultural and religious boundaries to recognize divine power regardless of earthly circumstances in which it appears or human expectations about how it should manifest itself according to conventional assumptions. about worthiness and procedure. Just say the word, he declares with confidence of someone who understands how authority operates and recognizes it when he encounters it, regardless of external appearances that might suggest weakness or insignificance to eyes trained to measure importance by worldly standards that value position and wealth and social status more than character and compassion and genuine power that serves rather than exploits those who come seeking help from sources beyond their own resources and understanding. His explanation reveals depth of faith that cuts through surface appearances to grasp essential reality of divine authority that operates according to principles different from human power, but far more effective in accomplishing purposes that matter eternally rather than temporarily, that heal rather than harm, that build up rather than tear down, those who trust in love that never fails even when circumstances suggest otherwise, to minds that measure divine faithfulness by immediate visible results rather than long-term spiritual development. Chapter 7. Walking among the people through the narrow streets of Capernaum, where morning air mingles the fresh scent of lake water with warm fragrance of bread baking in outdoor ovens, where fishermen mend their nets in doorways while children dart between market stalls and mothers call to them with voices that carry both affection and gentle authority. Jesus moves with unhurried pace that transforms ordinary encounters into sacred moments and routine interactions into opportunities for divine love to touch human hearts in ways both subtle and profound, ways that often go unnoticed until years later when memory reveals their significance. There is something in his presence that draws people naturally toward him, something that makes even the most guarded spirits open just enough to glimpse possibilities they had stopped daring to hope for, something that speaks of safety and acceptance and love that makes no demands while offering everything that weary souls have been seeking without knowing exactly what they needed or where they might find it in a world that offers many substitutes but few genuine sources of the peace that passes understanding and fills emptiness that material prosperity cannot touch. Watch as he pauses beside a tax collector's booth, that place of collaboration with occupying forces that has made its owner wealthy but despised, isolated from community by choices that seemed practical at the time, but proved costly in ways that money cannot measure or repair, leaving him surrounded by luxury but starved for fellowship, protected by Roman authority, but cut off from people whose respect and friendship he had traded for financial security that now feels more like prison than privilege. Matthew, as he was called, looked up from his ledgers and money bags to find eyes that held no condemnation for what he had become, no judgment for choices he had made, no disgust for compromises that had separated him from everything he once valued more than silver and gold, but instead carried invitation to discover what life might look like if he dared to believe that transformation was possible, that his past did not have to determine his future, that grace could reach even someone who had betrayed his own people for profit. "Follow me," Jesus said with voice that carried authority not of threat or coercion, but of love that sees potential where others see only failure, hope where others see only corruption, possibility where others see only permanent damage that cannot be undone or forgiven or transformed into something beautiful and useful for divine purposes that extend beyond human imagination or expectation about who qualifies for second chances and new beginnings. The invitation required abandoning everything that had provided security and status according to worldly measurements of success, walking away from income that exceeded most people's annual earnings, leaving behind position that guaranteed comfort and respect from Roman authorities, even if it meant isolation from Jewish community that viewed him as traitor, who had sold his soul and his heritage for temporal advantages that would disappear when empire eventually fell or moved its interests elsewhere. Yet something in Jesus' voice and manner convinced him that what was being offered exceeded anything he was being asked to sacrifice. That divine love represented treasure beyond compare with earthly accumulation. That relationship with God provided security more reliable than Roman protection and satisfaction. more complete than material abundance could ever deliver to hearts created for communion with their Creator, rather than endless pursuit of things that rust and decay, and ultimately disappoint those who trust in them completely. Matthew rose from his seat and followed, leaving his coins uncounted and his records unfinished, stepping away from life that had seemed successful according to conventional standards, but had left him empty in places that money could not fill, lonely in ways that wealth could not remedy, hungry for meaning that profitable business could not provide, because it addressed material needs while ignoring spiritual longing that drives human hearts to seek something worth living for and dying for and giving everything for when they encounter it. The religious leaders who observed this recruitment of notorious sinner into Jesus' inner circle expressed shock and displeasure that any teacher claiming divine authority would associate with someone whose reputation marked him as beyond redemption, whose choices had placed him outside boundaries of respectable society that maintained its purity through careful separation from contaminating influences that might compromise their standing with God and community. But Jesus' response revealed heart of his mission and character of divine love that seeks and saves what is lost rather than confirming in their lostness those who have wandered away from divine purposes, that heals rather than condemns those who are sick rather than congratulating those who are well, that comes not to call righteous who have no sense of their need for grace, but sinners who recognize their desperate need for forgiveness and transformation. It is not healthy who need doctor, but sick, he explained with patience that addressed their sincere concern, while challenging assumptions that had led them to conclude that association with sinners necessarily implied approval of sin rather than compassion for sinners, that divine love expressed itself through separation from need rather than engagement with need, through judgment rather than mercy, through condemnation rather than redemption, that transforms lives and hearts and purposes. Children seemed especially drawn to Jesus with instinctive recognition that bypassed intellectual analysis and went straight to heart's understanding of who could be trusted with their fears and dreams and questions that adults often dismissed as unimportant or naive, but which actually represented purest expressions of human need for love that accepts unconditionally, guidance that leads without manipulation, protection that never fails even when circumstances suggest otherwise. They sensed in him the kind of adult who would listen to their concerns without condescension, who would enter into their games without embarrassment about dignity or reputation that might be compromised by association with those whose social status provided no advantage or whose concerns seemed trivial, compared to weighty matters that occupied grown-up attention and conversation and planning for futures that children could not understand or contribute to in meaningful ways. When his disciples attempted to discourage such interruptions, thinking their master's time was too valuable to be spent on those who could contribute nothing to advancement of kingdom purposes through channels that children could never provide with their lack of resources and influence and understanding of complex theological and political issues that seemed far more important than innocent questions and simple observations about life and love and faith. "Let little children come to me," he said with authority that stopped disciples' protective intervention, while revealing truth they had not yet grasped about nature of kingdom he had come to establish, "and do not hinder them, for kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." Words that transformed children from interruptions to be managed into examples to be studied and emulated by adults who had forgotten what it meant to trust completely, to approach each day with expectancy rather than resignation, to find delight in simple pleasures rather than always requiring more sophisticated entertainment, in their unguarded trust that had not yet learned to doubt promises made by those who claimed to love them, in their capacity for wonder that found miracles in ordinary moments and beauty in common things, in their willingness to believe good things about people they had just met, rather than approaching every relationship with suspicion and calculation born from disappointment and betrayal. Jesus found perfect illustrations of faith that opens hearts to receive divine love without reservation or demand for proof that might satisfy suspicious minds, but would miss entirely the essence of relationship that thrives on trust rather than evidence. The encounter with Samaritan woman at Jacob's well demonstrated another dimension of Jesus' radical inclusiveness and his willingness to cross every barrier that human prejudice and social convention had erected to keep people separated from one another and from God, who created all people in his image and calls all people to relationship with him regardless of ethnic background or religious tradition or moral history that might disqualify them according to human judgment, but never disqualifies them according to divine grace. When he stopped at well to rest during heat of day, he broke multiple social conventions by speaking to woman, to Samaritan, to someone whose reputation in her own community was so damaged that she came to draw water at noon when other women would not be present to whisper about failed relationships and questionable lifestyle choices that had made her object of scorn rather than compassion among neighbors who preferred judgment to mercy. Their conversation moved from practical matter of drawing water to spiritual reality of worship that transcends geographic locations and religious traditions, from surface pleasantries to deepest longings of human heart for connection with divine love that satisfies, thirsts no earthly relationship or material possession has ever been able to quench completely or permanently, because they lack essential nature of what human souls actually need for wholeness and peace and joy that last beyond temporary circumstances. Chapter 8. Fellow seekers of peace, my precious child, as we pause here together in this sacred flow of story and spirit, as your breathing has naturally deepened into rhythm of blessed rest, and your heart has begun to quiet in presence of divine love that permeates every word we have shared, I find myself profoundly moved not only by our journey together, but by invisible community of seekers who have joined us across this sleeping world. Souls who understand what it means to hunger for peace in a culture that offers so little genuine rest, to thirst for meaning in existence that often feels fragmented by demands and distractions that pull attention away from what matters most to hearts created for communion with their Creator. You who have walked these ancient pathways with us tonight, who have witnessed Jesus touching lepers and welcoming children, calling tax collectors and challenging religious assumptions that create barriers between divine love and human need. You have experienced something more than historical narrative or theological instruction. You have encountered living presence of one who reaches across every boundary of time and culture to meet seeking hearts exactly where they are, offering not criticism for where they have been, but invitation to discover where divine grace can take them when they open themselves to transformation that only perfect love can accomplish. If these words have stirred something beautiful in your spirit, if you have felt walls of anxiety beginning to crumble in presence of perfect peace, if hope has awakened in chambers of your heart that had grown accustomed to disappointment and discouragement, then perhaps you sense what others have discovered in this gentle community of contemplative souls who gather regularly to explore together the inexhaustible riches found in person and work of Jesus Christ. Riches that multiply when shared rather than diminish, that grow stronger when discussed rather than weaker, that become more real through fellowship rather than less. Your presence here tonight has blessed our sacred gathering in ways you may not fully realize. For when authentic seekers come together around eternal truths that nourish souls rather than merely inform minds, when honest hearts share common hunger for divine love and genuine community, something beautiful happens that exceeds some of individual participants to become manifestation of kingdom of heaven, where barriers dissolve and strangers become family through shared recognition of their need for grace and their gratitude for grace received. This fellowship of seekers that forms around contemplative exploration of divine truth represents something precious and rare in modern world that often seems designed to fragment attention and fracture peace through constant stimulation and artificial urgency that keeps souls in state of perpetual restlessness, never quite settling long enough to receive nourishment they desperately need, never quite slowing down enough to hear voice of divine love that speaks most clearly in silence and stillness that modern life rarely provides without intentional effort to create space for contemplation. If you would like to continue walking this peaceful path with others who understand value of approaching faith through door of wonder rather than window of argument, through posture of humility rather than position of defensiveness, through heart of child rather than calculating mind of adult who has forgotten how to receive gifts without analyzing them, then I want to invite you into ongoing participation in community that values depth over speed, relationship over information, transformation over accumulation of knowledge that remains merely intellectual unless it penetrates heart and changes how we live. Your voice matters tremendously in conversations that form when people risk authenticity about their spiritual journeys, their questions and discoveries, their struggles with doubt and breakthrough moments when divine love becomes real in ways that surprise and delight and sustain through seasons of testing and growth and gradual conformity to image of Christ, who calls us not merely to admire him from distance, but to follow him closely enough to be changed by proximity to perfect love. Please share with us what aspects of Jesus' life and ministry speak most directly to your current needs and circumstances. What particular struggles or hopes or questions you carry that might benefit from gentle exploration and community of others who understand that faith is not destination we arrive at, but journey we take together, not achievement we accomplish, but gift we receive. Not performance we perfect, but relationship we enter through trust that dares to believe divine love is exactly what it claims to be. Perhaps you find yourself drawn to deeper study of Jesus' parables with their layers of meaning that reveal new truths each time we encounter them with fresh eyes and changed circumstances. Stories that speak to contemporary struggles with money and relationships and purpose in ways that demonstrate timeless relevance of divine wisdom to human experience, regardless of cultural context or historical period. These simple stories that used familiar images from daily life to illuminate eternal realities continue to penetrate hearts and transform lives because they address universal human needs and longings that remain constant across generations. Maybe you are curious about individual disciples and what we can learn from their unique relationships with Christ, their particular struggles with faith and doubt, their transformation from ordinary people living ordinary lives into extraordinary witnesses who turned world upside down through testimony about what they had seen and heard and experienced in presence of divine love that changed everything about how they understood themselves and their purpose and their destiny. Would you find value in exploring different ways Jesus interacted with various groups of people, and what those interactions reveal about how divine love addresses human diversity, breaks down cultural barriers, challenges social prejudices, and transforms religious traditions that have become more about maintaining power than serving people who need grace more than judgment, mercy more than condemnation, hope more than criticism that drives them further away from very love they need most? Your preferences and suggestions will help shape content we explore together in days and weeks ahead, ensuring that our community continues growing in directions that serve deepest needs and highest aspirations of those who choose to walk this path with us, who value contemplative approach to faith that nourishes soul and transforms heart, rather than simply filling mind with information that may or may not change how we actually live our daily lives in relationship with God and neighbor. Feel free to share honestly about where you find yourself in your spiritual journey, whether that involves excitement about new discoveries you are making, confusion about difficult teachings that challenge assumptions you have held, gratitude for grace you have received in unexpected ways, or uncertainty about how to apply what you are learning to practical realities of daily life with its demands and pressures and complicated relationships that require wisdom beyond human understanding. This is safe space for authentic expression, community where vulnerability is valued more than performance, where genuine seeking is honored more than having all right answers, where questions are welcomed as much as testimonies, because we understand that faith grows through honest inquiry, rather than fearful avoidance of topics that might disturb comfortable assumptions or challenge beliefs that have not been tested by real-life experience of walking with God through valleys and mountaintops alike. Rest now in knowledge that you belong to something beautiful and eternal, that your hunger for truth and peace and love connects you to a great cloud of witnesses who have found in Jesus not just historical figure to study, but living friend to follow. Not just teacher to admire, but Savior to trust. Not just example to emulate, but source of life and hope and joy that flows like rivers of living water to refresh souls that have grown weary in their journey toward home where perfect love casts out fear, and perfect peace guards hearts and minds in ways that surpass human understanding, but satisfy human longing completely. Chapter 9. The 12 and their stories, as our contemplative journey continues through sacred landscape of Christ's ministry. Beloved friend, let us draw closer to observe extraordinary transformation that occurs in lives of 12 ordinary men who accepted invitation that would change not only their own destinies, but entire course of human history. Men chosen not for religious credentials or spiritual maturity, but for willingness to follow wherever love might lead them, becoming living demonstration of what divine grace can accomplish in hearts open to being shaped by perfect love and infinite patience, working through daily relationship with one who sees potential where others see only problems. Feel yourself joining that inner circle gathered around Jesus as evening settles over hills of Galilee, watching as he looks into faces of these men who have left everything to follow him. Men whose lives have been forever altered by encounter with someone who saw not what they were, but what they could become through transforming power of grace that works patiently through seasons of growth and failure and renewed commitment to path requiring more courage and faith than any of them initially understood when they first responded to simple invitation. There is Simon, whom Jesus renamed Peter with prophetic insight that looked beyond present instability to future strength that would be forged through failures, teaching complete dependence upon divine grace rather than human determination, whose weathered hands spoke of years hauling nets from churning waters, but whose eyes revealed hunger for something beyond predictable rhythms of fishing and family that had defined his life until carpenter turned teacher spoke invitation penetrating straight to his restless heart, seeking meaning beyond daily survival. Peter possessed personality that spoke first and thought later, that acted on impulse rather than careful reflection, that promised more than human strength could deliver, yet somehow always found reserves of divine grace sufficient for whatever challenges love placed before him. When he learned to depend not on own resources but on power working through weakness rather than despite it, transforming failures into testimonies of divine faithfulness and mistakes into stepping stones towards spiritual maturity, achieved only through humbling experiences, breaking pride and building dependence. His journey from impulsive fisherman to rock-solid apostle would take him through depths of failure that would have destroyed lesser souls and heights of faithfulness, inspiring countless generations of believers who would find in his story encouragement for their own struggles with inconsistency and hope for their own potential despite present limitations, seeming to disqualify them for spiritual service or divine purposes requiring stronger characters than they possessed according to honest self-assessment. Beside him sits Andrew, Peter's quieter brother, who brought different gifts to their fellowship, possessing personality that preferred working behind scenes rather than in spotlight, attracting his more dramatic sibling, whose greatest joy came not from public recognition of own contributions, but from introducing others to teacher who had changed his life in ways making him want to share transformation with everyone he met regardless of background or apparent interest in spiritual matters. Andrew had gift of seeing potential in unlikely people and creating opportunities for them to encounter Jesus personally, beginning with his own brother and continuing throughout their years, together with consistent ministry of connection, building bridges between seeking hearts and love they were seeking, without always knowing how to find it or recognize it when it appeared in forms different from expectations about divine intervention, should look or feel or operate in human experience shaped by disappointment. His faithful service behind scenes, willingness to take secondary role while brother received more attention and recognition, persistent efforts to bring others into circle of divine love rather than focusing on own advancement or spiritual development that might have seemed more important from purely selfish perspective, demonstrated humble greatness that Jesus consistently praised above dramatic gestures, impressing crowds, but sometimes concealing pride, seeking glory for itself, rather than directing honor toward source of every good gift. James and John, sons of Zebedee, whose father had built successful fishing enterprise, providing comfortable living until Jesus called them to abandon nets and boats for adventure, proving far more rewarding than material success they might have achieved by continuing in commercial fishing, bringing temporary security, but never satisfying longings for meaning and purpose. Their souls recognized when encountering someone whose mission connected individual lives to eternal purposes outlasting every earthly kingdom. These brothers carried nicknames Sons of Thunder because of passionate temperaments and readiness to call down divine judgment upon anyone failing to receive Jesus with proper respect or showing insufficient appreciation for teachings that seemed obviously true and beneficial. That opposition could only be explained through willful blindness or deliberate wickedness, deserving immediate severe punishment rather than patient instruction, eventually opening closed minds and softening hardened hearts deceived by false shepherds. Their passionate natures served them well in situations where righteous indignation was appropriate response to injustice, or boldness was needed to proclaim truth in hostile environments, preferring comfortable lies to challenging truths, demanding change in thinking and living and relating to God and neighbor in ways violating established customs and social expectations about how religious people should behave in polite society, valuing conformity more than conversion and appearance more than authenticity. Under Jesus' patient influence, never trying to crush their spirits, but channeling energy into form's blessing rather than burdening those they were meant to serve, their capacity for righteous anger would be transformed into equally passionate love, eventually costing them everything they had to give, but providing everything they truly needed for fulfillment and satisfaction and joy no earthly circumstance could diminish because it flowed from source, never running dry. Philip brought practical, analytical mind to group, kind of person wanting to understand how things work before committing completely, who liked having plans and budgets and logical explanations for what they were being asked to do or believe. When Jesus tested him by asking how they might feed crowd of 5,000 hungry people, Philip immediately began calculating costs and logistics, his systematic mind missing opportunity to exercise faith in one specializing in making much from little. Yet his honest questions and straightforward personality made him approachable to those seeking Jesus but feeling intimidated by more dramatic personalities among disciples, those needing someone to translate spiritual truths into practical terms they could understand and apply to everyday lives filled with ordinary challenges, requiring extraordinary faith to navigate successfully while maintaining hope and joy, not depending on circumstances being favorable, but rooted in divine character, remaining constant regardless of external conditions. Nathanael, also called Bartholomew, initially approached Jesus with skepticism born from regional prejudice, wondering whether anything good could come from Nazareth, that insignificant village with no reputation for producing prophets or teachers worth following. But when Jesus demonstrated supernatural knowledge of his character and activities, speaking words revealing intimate knowledge of who he was and what he had been doing, Nathanael's doubt transformed instantly into worship, cynicism melting away before divine revelation. His journey from skepticism to faith became model for those needing evidence before they could believe, requiring personal encounter rather than second-hand testimony to convince them of spiritual truth, approaching claims about divine with healthy skepticism of those disappointed before and wanting to be sure They were not being deceived again by promises that would prove empty. When tested by real-life circumstances requiring more than human resources to navigate successfully. Thomas, forever remembered as Doubting Thomas, represented honest skeptic in every generation, struggling to believe extraordinary claims without extraordinary evidence, refusing to accept what others told him about resurrection and miracle until he could examine proof for himself. His refusal to accept other disciples' testimony about Jesus' resurrection until he could see and touch wounds personally was not weakness or rebelliousness, but intellectual integrity, caution of someone whose heart had been broken by disappointed hope. When Jesus appeared to him personally and invited him to examine evidence he required, when divine love met honest doubt with patient grace rather than frustrated condemnation, Thomas's declaration, "My Lord and my God," became one of most profound confessions of faith in all Scripture, testimony of someone whose doubts had been thoroughly answered and whose faith had been established on unshakable foundation of personal encounter with risen love. Chapter 10. Opposition and Persecution. As Jesus' influence continued expanding throughout Palestine like light penetrating darkness that had grown comfortable with shadows, reaching into every corner of Jewish society where his teachings challenged assumptions accepted without question for generations, and his presence inspired hope for changes threatening established order, built upon carefully maintained balances of power and privilege, serving those who had learned to manipulate religious systems for personal gain at expense of spiritual health among ordinary people seeking authentic relationship with God. Religious and political authorities who benefited from existing arrangements began recognizing this carpenter from Nazareth not as welcome spiritual reformer, but as fundamental threat to systems through which they maintained control. What had begun as curiosity about new teacher, whose methods differed from established rabbinical traditions, and whose popularity among common people was creating excitement in communities normally showing little enthusiasm for religious instruction, gradually hardened into skepticism about claims seeming too extraordinary to accept without more evidence than miraculous healings could provide to minds trained in logical analysis and empirical verification, demanding proof meeting standards established by authorities who had appointed themselves guardians of theological orthodoxy. This skepticism evolved into active opposition, seeking to discredit his authority through public challenges, designed to expose weaknesses in his theology or contradictions in his practices, providing grounds for dismissing him as dangerous deceiver whose influence needed curtailing. Before it could spread further among populations, religious authorities considered their responsibility to guide and protect from false teachings, leading them astray from paths established by centuries of tradition and scholarly interpretation. The Pharisees, who had built entire identity around meticulous observance of religious law, distinguishing them from common people they considered less spiritually disciplined and theologically informed, found themselves increasingly disturbed by Jesus' apparent disregard for traditions they held sacred as essential expressions of covenant faithfulness, separating God's people from surrounding nations whose moral standards represented everything faithful Jews were supposed to reject as incompatible with divine revelation. When his disciples picked grain on Sabbath to satisfy hunger, making concentration difficult during long day of ministry, beginning before dawn and continuing well after sunset, when he healed sick people on day designated for rest, supposed to be kept holy through abstinence from work, including medical practice according to interpretations developed by scholars spending years defining boundaries between necessary and unnecessary activities, he was challenging not just their practices but fundamental understanding of what it meant to honor divine commandments. Their objections to Jesus' behavior were not merely petty criticisms of minor infractions or expressions of personal animosity toward someone whose popularity threatened their influence among populations they had previously controlled through careful maintenance of complex systems designed to regulate every aspect of spiritual life, but sincere expressions of concern about what they perceived as dangerous departures from scriptural authority and ancestral wisdom, preserving Jewish identity through centuries of foreign occupation and cultural pressure. They had dedicated their lives to learning complex requirements of religious law, governing every aspect of daily existence from food preparation to business practices to social relationships, creating elaborate systems designed to help ordinary people avoid accidentally violating divine commandments whose transgression might result in spiritual contamination, separating them from holy God who could not tolerate sin in any form or degree. Jesus' casual attitude toward their protective traditions seemed to them like dangerous carelessness at best and blasphemous rebellion at worst, suggesting either ignorance of divine requirements any properly educated teacher should understand, or deliberate contempt for authority structures God himself had established through Moses and maintained through legitimate religious leadership, bearing responsibility for interpreting and applying eternal principles to contemporary situations, requiring wisdom accumulated through centuries of study and experience. His responses to their criticisms revealed heart issues behind theological objections, exposing how easily religious devotion could become religious pride, valuing system more than purpose it was meant to serve. How quickly concern for divine honor could transform into concern for personal reputation, depending upon being recognized as especially faithful by others, whose approval had become more important than divine approval coming to those understanding mercy triumphs over judgment. When he told them Sabbath was made for humanity rather than humanity for Sabbath, he was turning their understanding of divine purpose upside down in ways challenging everything they had been taught about proper priorities and spiritual values governing relationships between Creator and creation, between divine requirements and human needs, between eternal principles and temporal applications, requiring flexibility serving love rather than rigidity crushing spirits. Divine law was meant to liberate the Sadducees, who controlled temple operations and their lucrative financial arrangements while maintaining careful political relationships with Roman authorities, allowing them to preserve relative autonomy in religious matters as long as they prevented disturbances, attracting unwanted attention from imperial administrators having little patience for local customs interfering with efficient governance, and economic stability serving Roman interests more than Jewish welfare, saw Jesus primarily as threat to delicate balance they had achieved. Their opposition was motivated more by practical concerns about institutional preservation than doctrinal disagreements about theological interpretations. Though they certainly disagreed with aspects of his teaching, seeming to undermine authority structures through which they exercised influence over populations, whose religious activities generated revenue essential for maintaining temple services and supporting priestly families whose livelihood depended upon continued functioning of sacrificial system. Jesus appeared to be challenging through emphasis on mercy rather than ritual. The scribes and teachers of religious law, whose authority rested on expertise in interpreting ancient texts and applying scriptural principles to contemporary situations, found themselves intellectually threatened by someone who taught with direct authority rather than citing other authorities to support positions, as was customary among rabbis who built teachings on foundations laid by previous generations of scholars and interpreters, whose accumulated wisdom was supposed to guide contemporary understanding. Jesus did not need to reference earlier rabbis or quote established commentaries to validate his teachings, because he spoke with immediacy of personal knowledge, revealing divine truth with clarity, making their elaborate scholarly debates seem irrelevant and careful academic distinctions appear insignificant compared to transforming power of simple truth, spoken with authority coming from perfect relationship with Heavenly Father, whose will he knew intimately through eternal communion preceding incarnation. Their professional identity was built on being recognized experts in matters of religious law and spiritual interpretation, ones to whom ordinary people looked for guidance about proper belief and acceptable behavior, pleasing God and securing His blessing. Jesus' ability to teach profound truths in simple language connecting directly with human hearts bypassed their mediating function, making specialized knowledge seem unnecessary and authority appear questionable in ways threatening both livelihood and sense of purpose. The opposition intensified as religious leaders began testing Jesus with carefully crafted questions, designed to trap him in contradictions or force him to make statements that could be used against him either in religious courts or before Roman tribunals having power to impose severe penalties, including death for those found guilty of sedition or blasphemy that challenged established authority or threatened public order that empire worked to maintain through combination of local cooperation and imperial oversight. Chapter 11. The Final Journey to Jerusalem. The time had arrived for Jesus to set his face with unwavering determination toward Jerusalem, and everyone who knew him could sense profound shift in his demeanor as he prepared for what he understood with divine clarity would be his final journey to Holy City, where prophets had always come to deliver their ultimate messages, and often to die for truths religious establishments found too threatening to tolerate. Where greatest demonstration of divine love in human history would soon unfold before a world desperately needing to witness such complete self-sacrifice offered freely for sake of human redemption. The relaxed pace that had characterized his Galilean ministry, with gentle rhythms of teaching beside lake shores where crowds gathered like families around beloved teacher whose words brought comfort to troubled hearts and hope to discouraged spirits, was drawing to close as he gathered disciples for pilgrimage that would transform everything they thought they understood about divine power and human salvation, about earthly kingdoms and heavenly purposes, about victory looking like defeat and strength expressing itself through weakness confounding human wisdom. His closest followers, men who had walked with him through countless villages where his presence had brought healing and restoration to lives broken by disease and sin and despair that had seemed permanent until divine love proved stronger than every force opposing human flourishing and divine purposes never defeated by temporary appearances of failure or setback, recognized something fundamental had changed in their master's attitude and approach to ministry, previously seeming like pleasant journey through countryside filled with opportunities to demonstrate God's goodness. There was new intensity in his prayers lasting longer and penetrating depths they could not fathom, deeper urgency in his teaching pressing against hearts with weight of eternity, concentrated into words that would have to sustain followers through trials they could not yet imagine. Quality of purposeful determination seeming to pull him toward Jerusalem. Despite obvious dangers awaiting him, they're like storm clouds gathering on horizon everyone could see, but no one could prevent from releasing fury upon landscape having no choice but endure whatever heaven chose to send. The disciples followed with growing uneasiness, mixing excitement about accompanying their master to Holy City during most important religious celebration of Jewish year with increasing anxiety about what such journey might cost them personally in terms of safety and security. They had found in relatively peaceful ministry among villages of Galilee, where people generally received them with gratitude rather than hostility. Openness rather than suspicion characterizing atmosphere in Judea, where religious opposition was more organized and politically connected. Word of Jesus' approach spread ahead of them like wildfire racing across dry grassland, reaching villages and towns along their route where people came out to see teacher, whose reputation had traveled throughout Palestine and beyond its borders into regions where stories of miraculous healings and revolutionary teachings had created expectations varying dramatically depending on what hearers hoped to find in someone claiming authority over life and death, sickness and health, sin and forgiveness belonging to God alone. Some came seeking healing for themselves or loved ones, carrying sick children or elderly parents or disabled relatives representing last hope for families having exhausted every other resource in search of relief from conditions, resisting all conventional treatments while consuming financial reserves and emotional strength once seeming adequate for normal challenges, but proving insufficient when confronted with extraordinary needs requiring extraordinary intervention from source of power, operating according to principles different from those governing ordinary human experience and medical knowledge. Others were simply curious about man, who had become subject of so much discussion and debate among religious leaders who could not agree about his identity or significance, whose teachings seemed to contradict established interpretations of scriptural prophecy, while fulfilling expectations in ways traditional messianic theories had not anticipated, whose methods of ministry challenged institutional authorities while demonstrating power validating claims no mere human being should have been able to make without divine authorization. As they approached outskirts of Jerusalem, Jesus made arrangements to visit Bethany, small village where his close friends Mary, Martha, and Lazarus had welcomed him many times before, providing place of refuge and authentic fellowship, offering respite from demands of public ministry, never allowing complete privacy or total relaxation from responsibilities, weighing heavily on his human heart, even as his divine nature remained perfectly at peace with Father's will and eternal purposes. But this visit would involve more than rest and refreshment, becoming instead stage for most dramatic miracle of his entire earthly ministry, raising of Lazarus from dead after 4 days in tomb, demonstration of power over death itself that would send shockwaves throughout region and provide final evidence of his divine nature that would either convince honest seekers or harden opposition of those whose hearts had already been close to truth. No amount of evidence could penetrate. When Jesus finally arrived in Bethany, after deliberately delaying his response to urgent message about Lazarus' illness, he found household in mourning, with Martha and Mary grieving loss of beloved brother and wondering why he had not come sooner, why he had allowed someone he loved to die when his presence could have prevented such tragedy, plunging their family into sorrow and their community into sympathy for loss seeming so unnecessary and premature. Their questions revealed kind of honest wrestling with divine purposes characterizing authentic faith, struggle to understand how divine love can coexist with human suffering, how divine power can permit losses seeming preventable and unnecessary to human understanding, unable to see larger picture or comprehend ways even death serves purposes of love transcending earthly life and temporal relationships, mattering deeply but not representing final word about meaning and purpose of human existence. I am the resurrection and the life, Jesus declared to Martha with authority coming from intimate knowledge of divine plans human minds could not grasp in their entirety but could trust in their goodness because they originated in heart of infinite love, never failing those committing their lives to divine purposes even when they could not understand methods or timing, serving eternal purposes rather than temporary comfort. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die, he continued, revealing that physical death, which appears to end everything, actually represents transition for those whose faith connects them to life that transcends biological existence, life rooted in relationship with eternal God, who created human souls for fellowship lasting beyond earthly limitations and temporal circumstances that might suggest divine abandonment, but actually serve divine purposes. When he approached tomb where Lazarus had been buried according to Jewish custom, Jesus wept with tears, revealing both his genuine human emotion in face of death's apparent victory and his divine compassion for suffering that sin had introduced into world he had created for joy and fellowship and abundant life rather than sorrow and separation and death that seemed to mock divine promises about goodness and faithfulness and love stronger than every opposing force. Take away the stone, he commanded, though Martha protested that 4 days of decomposition would create unbearable stench, her practical concerns reflecting natural human tendency to measure divine power by human limitations rather than recognizing that one who created life from dust could certainly restore life to dust, that death represented no barrier to divine authority over every created thing, including biological processes governing life and death. "Lazarus, come out," he called with voice carrying authority over death itself. And immediately man who had been dead 4 days emerged from tomb, still wrapped in burial cloths but unmistakably alive, breathing, moving, restored not just to life but to health and strength that demonstrated divine power extending beyond healing sickness to conquering death itself, ultimate enemy of human flourishing and divine purposes for creation. The miracle sent shockwaves throughout Jerusalem, where religious authorities realized their opposition to Jesus could no longer be based on theological disagreements or questions about his authority, but had become matter of choosing between accepting divine truth that challenged everything they had built their lives upon or eliminating source of that truth through whatever means necessary to preserve systems and positions and power they valued more than spiritual reality. Chapter 12. The Last Supper and Betrayal. In profound stillness settling over sacred moments when eternity intersects with time. Beloved child, feel yourself entering with reverent heart upper room in Jerusalem, where atmosphere heavy with anticipation and sorrow. Joy and grief intermingled like wine and tears in same cup. Jesus would soon offer to disciples as symbol of new covenant being established through his blood, poured out for many for forgiveness of sins, separating humanity from holy God, who cannot look upon iniquity, but chooses to look upon beloved Son, bearing that iniquity in place of those deserving judgment, but receiving mercy instead. Evening shadows lengthened as 13 men reclined around low table, sharing what they all sensed would be final meal together before everything changed forever. Though only Jesus fully comprehended magnitude of what was about to unfold and cost of love that would be demonstrated through sacrifice, beyond human ability to understand or appreciate without divine revelation illuminating its significance for every human soul ever living or ever to live upon earth, groaning under weight of sin and death and separation from Creator. Disciples sensed something momentous approaching, but their understanding remained clouded by continued expectation that Jesus might yet reveal himself as political Messiah they had been hoping for, that this Passover celebration in Jerusalem might be moment when he finally claimed throne and established earthly kingdom they had been anticipating throughout years of following him and learning from him and witnessing his power over disease and death and forces of nature, obeying his voice without question. The room itself was simple and humble, furnished with basic necessities for Passover observance but containing none of luxury that might befit what disciples imagined should be celebration of their Master's approaching coronation as King of Israel, who would drive out Roman oppressors and restore glory days their people remembered from stories of great kings ruling when God's blessing rested visibly upon their nation and enemies trembled before might of armies fighting under divine protection. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows on whitewashed walls, creating an atmosphere of intimacy, drawing 13 men together around table, where bread and wine awaited blessing that would transform ordinary meal into most significant dinner in human history, institution of sacrament that would be remembered and repeated by believers throughout world for thousands of years, as memorial of love poured out completely for redemption of lost humanity. Jesus rose from his place and did something shocking disciples into stunned silence and uncomfortable confusion, revealing how little they understood about nature of kingdom he had come to establish and kind of leadership he intended to model for them and everyone who would claim to follow him in path of service rather than domination, love rather than power, sacrifice rather than self-advancement characterizing kingdoms of this world. He removed outer garment, wrapped towel around waist, and began washing their feet like lowly servant in household, performing menial task none had volunteered to do. Accepting role their pride had prevented them from undertaking because they were still thinking about greatness in terms world understands rather than terms heaven values and God rewards with approval, mattering more than human recognition or earthly status, passing away like morning mist. Sounds in room became muted and awkward as reality of what was happening penetrated their consciousness. Gentle splash of water in basin, soft rustle of towel, quiet intake of breath as each disciple realized his master was kneeling before him to perform work, even household. Slaves often tried to avoid because it placed them in position of serving those they considered beneath them in social hierarchy. Jesus was deliberately overturning. Peter's protest revealed deep offense. Divine humility causes to human pride and conventional thinking about authority and leadership, assuming those with power should be served by those without power rather than using their power to serve others, needing what they had ability to provide through gifts and resources entrusted to them by divine providence for benefit of community rather than personal advantage or social advancement. "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" he asked, his question carrying undertones of shock and embarrassment at witnessing teacher perform work of servant. Confusion coming when divine love operates according to principles, contradicting everything world teaches about power and position, and way relationship should work between those having authority and those supposed to submit to it without question or reservation. But Jesus' response cut through Peter's objection to reveal deeper significance of what was happening. Spiritual truth being enacted through physical demonstration of service and humility, pointing beyond itself to greater cleansing his death would accomplish for everyone, believing in him and receiving gift of salvation purchased through perfect sacrifice on cross, where divine love would demonstrate its character through willingness to pay any price for human redemption. "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me," he explained, transforming foot washing from simple object lesson into profound symbol of spiritual cleansing, coming not through human effort, but through divine grace, not through what we do for God, but through what God does for us in love that serves rather than demands service, gives rather than requires payment, cleanses rather than condemns those needing purification they cannot provide for themselves. When washing was complete and Jesus had returned to his place at table, he began speaking words that would be treasured and pondered by every generation of believers until he comes again to establish fully the kingdom he was now inaugurating through life and approaching death and resurrection that would validate every claim he had made about his identity and mission and relationship with Father who sent him. As they shared Passover meal with traditional elements and familiar prayers, connecting them to ancestors' experience of divine deliverance from slavery in Egypt, Jesus took unleavened bread commemorating their forefathers' hasty departure from bondage and invested it with meaning that would echo through eternity as symbol of his body, given for redemption of humanity enslaved to sin and death and separation from God, who created them for fellowship with himself. "Take and eat," he said, breaking bread and distributing it among disciples, receiving these familiar elements with growing awareness that something unprecedented was happening. "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Simple act of sharing food became profound symbol of divine love poured out completely for human salvation, transforming ordinary meal into sacred covenant, binding believers to their Savior and to one another across centuries and cultures. Similarly, cup of wine traditionally representing joy and divine blessing became symbol of new covenant, sealed not with blood of sacrificial animals, but with Jesus' own life poured out for forgiveness of sins, separating human hearts from holy, God-desiring relationship but unable to compromise perfect righteousness by ignoring rebellion that must be dealt with according to divine justice, tempered by infinite mercy expressed through substitutionary sacrifice. "This cup is new covenant in my blood," he told them as they shared wine that would forever after remind followers of price paid for their redemption, which is poured out for you and for many for forgiveness of sins. Disciples received these elements with reverence, though they could not yet grasp full significance of what Jesus was telling them, could not comprehend they were participating in inauguration of relationship between God and humanity lasting forever. But atmosphere in room shifted dramatically as Jesus made announcement, sending shock waves through intimate fellowship. words falling like stones into peaceful gathering and creating ripples of confusion and distress, reaching every heart around table where love had been celebrated and covenant established through shared bread and wine that would become perpetual reminder of sacrifice securing their salvation. "One of you will betray me," he declared, and they began asking one by one whether surely he did not mean them, their voices revealing genuine bewilderment at possibility that anyone among their number could be capable of such treachery against one who had loved them so completely and demonstrated such patience with their failures and such faith in their potential, despite their obvious weaknesses and frequent misunderstandings. Chapter 13. The Cross and the Crown. From peaceful intimacy of upper room, where love had been demonstrated through service and covenant, established through shared bread and wine, that would forever remind believers of price paid for their redemption. My precious child, we find ourselves following Jesus through sleeping streets of Jerusalem toward garden called Gethsemane, place of ancient olive trees where he had often retreated for prayer and communion with Heavenly Father, whose will he had come to accomplish regardless of personal cost that would be extracted from human nature united with divine nature in perfect harmony, about to experience perfect agony. A garden that had been sanctuary of peace during previous visits, where solitude and natural beauty had provided perfect environment for contemplation and worship, refreshing his human spirit while strengthening resolve to complete mission, bringing him from heavenly glory to earthly sorrow, felt different this night as they passed beneath branches heavy with leaves rustling in evening, breeze like whispered prayers ascending toward stars, witnessing countless human struggles, but none comparable to cosmic conflict about to unfold. Atmosphere was charged with sense of impending crisis, even disciples could sense, despite incomplete understanding of what was approaching with each passing hour, bringing them closer to events, transforming their understanding of everything they thought they knew about divine power and human salvation, about earthly kingdoms and heavenly purposes, about victory appearing as defeat and strength expressing itself through weakness confounding worldly wisdom, while revealing divine love in purest form. Jesus' demeanor had changed from tender intimacy they had experienced during final meal together to something heavier, more burdened by weight of divine mission, reaching climactic moment when all accumulated sin and suffering of humanity would be concentrated into single experience of separation from Father's love that would be more agonizing than any physical torture human cruelty could devise, more devastating than death itself because it would involve spiritual anguish perfect holiness experiences when it comes into contact with moral corruption. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to point of death," he told Peter, James, and John, 3 disciples chosen to accompany him deeper into garden, while others waited at entrance where they could watch for approaching danger he knew was coming, but which they hoped might somehow be avoided. If they remained vigilant and prepared to defend their master against enemies seeking his destruction through means appearing to triumph but actually accomplishing opposite of their intentions. His words revealed profound humanity of one who was fully divine, showing incarnation meant experiencing complete range of human emotion, including anguish so intense it threatened to crush even divine strength, sustaining him through every previous trial and temptation. Revealing salvation would be accomplished not through divine power, bypassing human suffering, but through divine love, entering fully into human experience including darkest moments when hope seems extinguished and faith appears foolish. "Stay here and keep watch with me," he requested with voice carrying both authority of divine command and vulnerability of human need for companionship during hour when isolation would make agony even more unbearable, when loneliness would compound physical and spiritual torment into combination of sufferings no human being had ever endured or ever could endure except one whose perfect innocence made him capable of bearing guilt he had never earned while maintaining perfect love. Moving beyond even closest companions whose presence provided some comfort, but could not share burden that was his alone to carry according to divine plan. Requiring substitutionary sacrifice only sinless one could offer on behalf of sinful humanity, Jesus fell face down on ground, receiving his prostrate form, like altar prepared for sacrifice, surpassing every offering ever made in human history. His face pressed against earth that would soon drink his blood. "My Father," he prayed with voice carrying agony no human throat had ever expressed. Words torn from depths of divine nature, wrestling with human nature in perfect unity, yet perfect tension as two aspects of his being confronted. Reality of what perfect love was willing to endure for sake of imperfect creatures, deserving judgment, but receiving mercy through substitute experiencing their condemnation. "If it is possible, may this cup be taken from me." Prayer revealed both human desire to avoid suffering and divine willingness to embrace whatever Father's love required for human salvation. Natural human recoil from pain, making his willingness to endure it more remarkable and meaningful, because he was not eager for suffering, not immune to horror of what awaited him, not coldly detached from physical and spiritual agony. Crucifixion represented in fullest dimensions of divine wrath against human sin. Yet even in moment of ultimate testing, when human nature recoiled from suffering ahead, and divine nature grieved over necessity, making such suffering unavoidable. If love was to triumph over justice without compromising either attribute of divine character, demanding both perfect righteousness and perfect mercy, be satisfied through means human wisdom could never have devised, Jesus concluded prayer with words securing redemption of everyone who would ever believe. "Not as I will, but as you will." He surrendered with submission, revealing perfect harmony between Father and Son, even in moment when that harmony would be temporarily broken by sin-bearing, separating them in ways never occurring in eternity past and never occurring again in eternity future, making this moment unique in divine experience as love embraced suffering for sake of creatures who could never repay debt they owed. When morning came and betrayer arrived with soldiers sent by religious authorities who had finally found excuse, they needed to arrest troublesome teacher, whose influence threatened their control over populations they considered their property to manipulate and exploit for personal gain. Jesus submitted without resistance to arrest, beginning process leading to cross where divine love would triumph over human hatred through apparent defeat, actually representing greatest victory in cosmic history. The trials that followed were travesties of justice from beginning to end, conducted by religious leaders who had already decided on verdict and were merely seeking legal justification for predetermined conclusion, eliminating threat Jesus posed to their authority and influence, bringing forward false witnesses whose testimonies contradicted each other, asking trick questions designed to entrap him into statements construed as blasphemy or sedition, ultimately condemning him for crime of claiming to be who he actually was. Pontius Pilate's examination of Jesus provided one of most revealing conversations in all Scripture, as earthly power came face to face with heavenly authority and found itself completely outmatched by prisoner, refusing to defend himself in conventional ways, but responding with questions, penetrating the heart of every human assumption about power and truth and authority and kingdom values that endure beyond temporal circumstances and human institutions. "My kingdom is not of this world," Jesus explained with quiet dignity, revealing fundamental difference between kingdoms built on force and intimidation and kingdom built on truth and love. "If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest, but now my kingdom is from another place." Words demonstrating that ultimate authority operates according to principles transcending human understanding, but serving divine purposes that will not be defeated by temporary appearances of failure. The physical torture Jesus endured, flogging that tore his flesh to ribbons, crown of thorns mocking his kingship while inflicting excruciating pain, beating and spitting and humiliation reducing him to something barely recognizable as human, became price divine love paid to purchase human redemption, each stripe representing sin forgiven, each drop of blood speaking of mercy extended. each moment of agony demonstrating lengths to which God would go to restore relationship. Feel weight of cross as Jesus carried it through streets of Jerusalem, surrounded by crowd including some who wept for him and others who mocked his apparent defeat and humiliation. Wood that would become instrument of his death, weighing heavy on shoulders already weakened by sleeplessness, betrayal, beating, and spiritual agony of bearing sin he never committed. Until Simon of Cyrene was compelled to carry it for him. Golgotha, place of skull, became stage for ultimate demonstration of divine love. Altar on which Lamb of God was sacrificed for sins of world. Nails piercing hands and feet driving through flesh and bone into wood beneath. Darkness covering land from noon until 3 in afternoon, serving as testimony to cosmic significance of what was taking place on hill outside Jerusalem, where everything changed forever. Yet even in agony, suspended between heaven and earth with life ebbing away drop by precious drop, Jesus continued demonstrating character of divine love that never stops loving even when being murdered. He prayed for executioners with words revealing heart of God toward human ignorance and sin. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Offering hope to repentant thief, hanging beside him with promise of paradise. My God, why have you forsaken me?" he cried, revealing spiritual agony exceeding all physical torture. Moment when perfect fellowship between Father and Son was broken as divine wrath against human sin fell upon sinless substitute who had taken our place on altar of justice. Separation our rebellion deserved experienced by one who never rebelled, so we might experience fellowship his perfect obedience deserved. "It is finished," he cried with final breath, words carrying across hillside and into eternity with force of ultimate victory rather than defeat, completion rather than failure, triumph rather than tragedy, work of redemption complete, price of sin fully paid. Way to God open permanently for all who would believe and receive gift of salvation, purchased with precious blood of perfect substitute who died in our place. Chapter 14. The promise fulfilled in profound silence following Jesus' death. Silence broken only by weeping of women who had loved him and awed whispers of witnesses recognizing they had observed something. Unprecedented challenge in every assumption about power and weakness, victory and defeat, life and death governing human understanding of how divine purposes operate in world often seeming abandoned by benevolent force capable of intervening on behalf of those suffering through no fault of their own. Very fabric of creation seemed to hold its breath as earth and heaven processed completion of most significant event in human history. Roman centurion who had supervised countless executions during military career, professional soldier accustomed to witnessing death in most brutal forms without allowing emotion to interfere with duty, requiring him to maintain order among crowds gathering to watch public punishment, designed to deter crime through display of consequences awaiting those challenging imperial authority or violating laws maintaining peace essential for commerce and governance, found himself compelled to acknowledge what he had observed with conviction, surprising him. Surely this was righteous man, he declared, and according to some accounts, truly this man was Son of God. Words emerging from depths of his being where truth resided despite years of training, designed to suppress such responses in favor of professional detachment, allowing soldiers to perform duties without being paralyzed by moral qualms or emotional reactions, interfering with effectiveness required for maintaining imperial order through force when necessary. Joseph of Arimathea, wealthy member of ruling council who had been secret follower of Jesus throughout ministry but had lacked courage to publicly identify himself with teacher, whose popularity among common people was matched by hostility from religious authorities, finally found strength to act according to convictions when love compelled him to ensure Jesus received honorable burial, befitting true identity as Son of God whose death had accomplished salvation. Together with Nicodemus, another member of religious establishment who had first come to Jesus under cover of darkness to avoid being seen by colleagues who would have questioned his interest in teacher, whose methods challenged their authority and whose message threatened comfortable assumptions. About divine approval based on external performance rather than heart transformation, Joseph carefully removed Jesus' body from cross. They wrapped body in linen cloths with expensive spices costing them considerable sum, but representing investment in hope that death was not final word in story of one who had claimed power over life and death, who had promised resurrection seeming impossible according to natural laws, but possibly according to supernatural power demonstrated through miracles. They had witnessed during ministry among people experiencing healing and restoration, defying medical explanation. Tomb where they laid Jesus' body was new one Joseph had prepared for his own eventual use, carved from solid rock in garden near place of crucifixion, sealed with massive stone requiring several strong men to move under normal circumstances. Guarded by Roman soldiers posted at request of religious authorities remembering his predictions about rising from dead on third day and wanting to prevent disciples from stealing body and claiming resurrection had occurred. Early on first day of week, before dawn had fully broken over Jerusalem still sleeping in aftermath of Passover celebration, overshadowed by execution, shocking even those who had demanded it, Mary Magdalene made her way to tomb carrying spices to anoint Jesus' body. Her heart heavy with sorrow but devotion compelling her to perform final act of service for one who had transformed her life by freeing her from demons and giving her purpose and identity and hope. When she arrived at Garden Tomb, she discovered something challenging every assumption about permanence of death and finality of separation death creates between those who remain and those who depart, something transforming her grief into joy, despair into hope, questions into certainty about divine love's ultimate victory over every force opposing human flourishing in divine purpose is never defeated by temporary appearances of failure. Massive stone that had sealed entrance was rolled away, not from outside as if someone had broken into steel body, but from inside as if someone had broken out, lying at angles suggesting it had been moved not by human strength, but by supernatural force, making its weight irrelevant to purposes operating according to principles transcending physical laws and human limitations governing ordinary existence, but proving inadequate when divine power intervenes. Angels whose very presence transformed tomb into sanctuary of divine glory greeted her bewilderment with words echoing through eternity, bringing hope to every heart ever broken by loss and every soul ever wondering whether love is strong enough to overcome death and separation and all forces threatening to destroy what God has created and called good. Despite current brokenness requiring redemption, only divine intervention can provide. Why do you look for living among dead? They asked with voices carrying music of heaven into earthly sorrow. He is not here. He has risen, just as he said. Their invitation to come and see place where he lay, becoming invitation to witness evidence that death had been conquered. Grave robbed of victory. Hope not only restored but vindicated in most wonderful way imaginable by love proving stronger than hatred. When Mary encountered risen Christ, initially mistaking him for gardener in grief-blinded state, unable to accept possibility, that impossible had become possible, that dead had become alive, that end had become new beginning, his voice speaking her name with same tenderness and recognition that first called her out of demonic oppression into freedom of divine love penetrated through grief and shock to kindle recognition, transforming tears of sorrow into tears of joy. Do not hold on to me, Jesus gently instructed when she fell at his feet trying to hold on to him as if physical contact could guarantee. This miraculous reunion would not prove to be another dream born from desperate longing. For I have not yet ascended to Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Words revealing resurrection had not just restored former life, but transformed it into something new and glorious. Mary became first evangelist of resurrection, running to disciples with news changing everything. I have seen the Lord. Her testimony initially met with skepticism and disbelief because it seemed too good to be true, becoming first ripple in wave of resurrection appearances, convincing even most doubting hearts that death had been defeated, that Jesus was indeed who he claimed to be, that salvation he promised had been accomplished through perfect sacrifice and glorious resurrection, validating every promise and fulfilling every hope human hearts had ever dared to embrace about divine love and eternal life. Chapter 15. Until we meet again in peace here, at gentle conclusion of our sacred journey, together through life and love of Jesus Christ. As peaceful darkness of night settles around you like most comforting embrace, speaking of divine care for every detail of your existence from greatest triumph to smallest concern weighing upon your heart, and your breathing naturally deepens into rhythm of blessed rest, coming from knowing you are held by arms, never growing weary of carrying you through every trial and joy, awaiting you in days ahead. I want to pause with you in profound gratitude for precious hours we have shared walking together through most beautiful and transformative story ever told to human hearts hungering for hope and thirsting for love that never fails. We began this evening with you carrying whatever burdens today had placed upon your shoulders, perhaps feeling overwhelmed by responsibilities seeming to multiply faster than your strength to meet them, possibly questioning your worth, or wondering if there truly existed love in this universe that knew your name and cared about your deepest needs and longest struggles, sometimes feeling too heavy for human heart to bear without breaking under weight of disappointment and discouragement, accumulating like dust on traveler's cloak until rest and refreshment wash it away. We conclude with you resting securely in embrace of that very love we have encountered together, surrounded by truth that you have never been alone and never could be alone, because you are cherished beyond your ability to comprehend by one who spoke galaxies into existence, yet pays attention to every whispered prayer and silent longing of your heart that may feel insignificant when compared to cosmic forces and global events, but matters infinitely to divine love, measuring significance not by size but by depth of care invested. The Jesus we have met together in these quiet hours is not merely figure from ancient history, confined to pages of old books or memories of civilizations crumbled into dust, but living presence reaching across every barrier of time and space to touch tired hearts exactly like yours, to offer rest to weary souls exactly like yours, to extend forgiveness and acceptance to imperfect people exactly like you and me, needing grace more than anything else this world could offer to satisfy longings only divine love can reach and heal and fill completely. His love transcends historical boundaries and cultural limitations to meet you in your present circumstances with same tenderness, characterizing his interactions with disciples who disappointed him, and crowds who misunderstood him, and enemies who betrayed him yet never exhausted his capacity for forgiveness or diminished his commitment to their welfare despite their treatment of him during years when he walked among them, demonstrating what divine love looks like when it takes human form and enters human experience with all its pain and beauty and complexity. If this sacred journey has brought even moment of genuine peace to your troubled heart, carrying anxiety and worry like stones in pocket growing heavier with each passing day, if these ancient stories have awakened something beautiful in your spirit sleeping under weight of disappointment and discouragement, accumulating through experiences of broken promises and failed relationships and dreams dying slow deaths, if you have found yourself breathing more freely or feeling more connected to love holding universe together, then you have discovered treasure worth guarding and sharing. This treasure is meant to be shared with others walking same pathways of seeking and struggling that you have walked, carrying same burdens of loneliness and fear and confusion you have carried, asking same questions about meaning and purpose and hope you have asked during seasons when life seemed empty of divine presence and barren of divine purpose, making suffering meaningful and struggles worthwhile instead of senseless endurance of pain, serving no purpose except to test limits of human patience and faith. By choosing to join our family of fellow seekers through connection, linking you to continued journey together through contemplative narratives, nourishing rather than draining, building up rather than tearing down spirits, wounded by harsh words and disappointed by broken promises, and confused by messages demanding more than they give. You become part of something transcending individual experience, to become participation in eternal story of divine love pursuing human hearts across every barrier of time and culture and circumstance. Your presence in this community matters more than you might realize, dear friend, because when you open your heart to receive divine love through these ancient stories, never growing old or losing their power to transform lives and change destinies, you create ripples extending far beyond your individual experience to bless everyone whose path intersects with yours in days and weeks and months ahead. Everyone encountering in your eyes something of peace you have found, hearing in your voice something of hope you have received. What specific aspects of Jesus' life and ministry would you most like to explore in our future times together? Perhaps you find yourself drawn to deeper examination of his parables with their layers of meaning and surprising relevance to contemporary struggles with relationships and purpose, and the search for authentic spiritual community in world often feeling fragmented and superficial in its connections between people who long for deeper fellowship but struggle to find it in conventional religious settings. Maybe you are curious about the individual disciples and what we can learn from their unique journeys with Christ, their particular struggles with faith and doubt, their transformation from ordinary people living ordinary lives into extraordinary witnesses, turning world upside down through testimony about what they had seen and heard and experienced in presence of divine love, changing everything about how they understood themselves and their purpose and their eternal destiny in kingdom that lasts forever. Would you find value in exploring seasonal themes that follow rhythm of church calendar, walking with Jesus through his birth and childhood during Advent and Christmas seasons, contemplating his temptation and early ministry during Epiphany, journeying with him through passion and death during Lent, celebrating resurrection during Easter, considering implications of his ascension and coming of Holy Spirit during Pentecost, an ordinary time when we learn to live in light of these great truths? Perhaps your heart is drawn toward more mystical dimensions of faith, ways that contemplative practices can deepen our awareness of divine presence in daily life. Spiritual disciplines that saints and sages throughout centuries have used to cultivate intimacy with God and learn to recognize his voice above all other voices, competing for our attention in a world filled with noise and distraction and artificial urgency, keeping souls restless when they were created for peace. Your voice matters profoundly in this community, precious friend, because your unique perspective and experience enrich understanding of everyone else participating in these sacred conversations about things that matter most. Things that last beyond temporal circumstances and human achievements to touch eternal realities, giving meaning and purpose to every moment of earthly existence, when seen through eyes of faith and understood through heart transformed by grace. Please share honestly about where you find yourself in your spiritual journey, whether that involves excitement about new discoveries you are making about divine love and its practical implications for daily living, confusion about difficult teachings, challenging assumptions you have held about God and faith and meaning of discipleship in contemporary world, gratitude for grace you have received in unexpected ways through circumstances that seemed discouraging but proved to be doorways to deeper understanding and stronger faith. Sleep now in perfect peace, surrounded by perfect love, held by perfect grace, covering every imperfection and transforming every weakness into strength, every failure into learning, every ending into new beginning, filled with possibilities as infinite as love that created you and will never stop believing in wonderful person you are becoming through divine transformation, working patiently in depths of your being until that day when faith becomes sight and hope becomes reality and love reigns eternal in hearts. Learning to trust completely in promises proving more reliable than sunrise and more constant than seasons. Good night, dear one, and may divine love fill your dreams with visions of glory awaiting you. May angels watch over your sleep with protection never failing, and may you awaken tomorrow refreshed not only in body, but renewed in spirit, ready for another day of walking in love making. Every ordinary moment sacred, and every simple act of kindness participation in divine purposes, extending far beyond what eyes can see or minds can comprehend, but hearts can trust completely because they flow from source of all good gifts and perfect blessings, never disappointing those who wait with patient hope for fulfillment of every promise, made by lips that never lie and heart that never changes in its commitment to those who call upon name above every name, and trust and love that never fails.